For 137 years, the most infamous killer in human history has had no face, no name that stuck, no verdict, just a shadow moving to the fog of Victorian London, a phantom who slipped between the gas lamps and vanished into legend. And in that time, the world has thrown everything it has at the question. Detectives, music, historians, novelists, amateur sleuths who gave up years of their lives chasing a ghost. Nothing worked. The file stayed open. The name stayed hidden until now because two British scientists say they have finally done what Scotland Yard could not. Not a theory, not a hunch dressed up as a headline, not clickbait. They say they have the DNA. They say they ran the tests, compared the samples, and watched the results line up with a precision the Victorian police could never have imagined. And they say the science points with total certainty to a single music man, a man who was already on a police list, a man the authorities were quietly watching the entire time, which raises a question far more disturbing than the identity itself. If they knew who he was, if the men in charge of the case wrote his name down in private and believed it to their dying day, then why did they let him get away with it? That is the story. And by the end of this video, you will have the name, you will have the science, and you will have the answer. But to understand why this discovery lands like a bombshell, you first have to understand the size of the legend it just shattered. Because for more than a century, Jack the Ripper was never really treated as a man at all. He was a ghost story, a creature stitched together out of fog and gaslight and shadow. He belonged less to the world of criminal records than to the world of campfire tales. The thing that lived in the space where the street lamp glow gave out and the darkness began. Think about what that darkness looked like. Autumn 1888, the east end of London, a district called Whitechapel, wrapped in the thick yellow smog that Londoners called a pea souper. Fog so dense with coal smoke that a man could stand 3 feet from you and be nothing more than a smudge. Cobblestones slick with rain and worse. Narrow courts and blind alleys branching off streets that branched off other streets. A maze that even the police who patrolled it could get lost in. And somewhere in that maze, a killer was working. Not just music killing, doing something to his victims so deliberate, so anatomical, so cold that it terrified a city of 4 million people and then terrified the world. And the world responded the way it always does to horror it cannot explain. It reached for a grand story. Surely, people insisted, a man capable of this had to be someone extraordinary, someone special. He had to be a brilliant surgeon, they said, given how neatly he seemed to cut. Music, or a mad artist drenched in some twisted vision, or an aristocrat slumbing the gutters for sport. The theories grew wilder and wilder, feeding on the public's hunger for the killer to be somebody worthy of the crimes. Because if he was ordinary, if he music, was just some anonymous nobody from the poorest streets in Britain, then the horror had no meaning. It was just random, and random was unbearable. So, music, the legends bloomed. One of the most enduring insisted the murders were a royal cover-up. Music. The story went like this. Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria herself, second in line to the throne, had secretly fathered a child with a poor Catholic woman, a group of desperate women in Whitechapel. So this theory claimed, learned the secret and tried to blackmail the crown. And to protect the monarchy, a shadowy circle of Freemasons supposedly orchestrated the murder of every woman who knew, silencing them one by one with surgical precision on the fog-choked streets. It had everything a great conspiracy needs. A prince, a secret baby, a hidden brotherhood. Ritual killings meant to look like the work of a lone madman. People, music, loved it. People still love it. And it was almost certainly complete fiction. But it tells you exactly what the public wanted the Ripper to be. Powerful, connected, music important. Scotland Yard, meanwhile, drowned hundreds of suspects, thousands of letters, a tidal wave of tips, accusations, and false confessions music, pouring in from a public, whipped into a frenzy by newspapers that had discovered a killer sold papers like nothing else on earth. And out of all that chaos, the police had exactly zero proof, no fingerprints. The technique barely existed yet. No forensic labs. No way to test a blood stain and learn anything more than that it was blood. They had a whistle, a wooden truncheon, and their own 2 eyes. Against a man who moved like smoke, it was almost nothing. So the case slid decade by decade out of the world of law and into the world of myth, the unsolvable phantom, the one that got away forever. And that is where it stayed. Locked, sealed. A mystery so famous that solving it seemed almost beside the point. The fog was the fun of it. Every generation produced a new book, music, a new suspect, a new confident author swearing. This time it was the doctor, the painter, the prince, the poet. And every generation the phantom slipped away again laughing. But here's the thing about phantoms. They leave nothing behind. And the whole reason we are here, the reason this case just cracked open after nearly a century and a half, is that the Whitechapel killer on one terrible night may have left something behind after all. Something small, something that survived, something that sat ignored and dismissed and half forgotten in private hands for well over 100 years while the world argued about princes and masons. Because the entire story, the science, the name, the answer to that awful question of why they let him walk, it doesn't come down to a grand conspiracy or a secret royal document. It comes down to a single object, one stained, tattered, ordinary-looking piece of cloth, a silk shawl. To most people who ever laid eyes on it, it looked like junk, faded, discolored, marked with old brown stains that could have been anything. The kind of thing you'd find at the bottom of a box at an estate sale and toss without a second glance. But this shawl carried a claim that, if true, made it one of the most valuable objects on the planet, because according to the story handed down with it, this shawl was there at the scene, on the night of September the 30th, 1888, beside the body of the Ripper's fourth victim, a woman named Catherine Eddowes. And if that was true, if this scrap of silk had really lain in that dark corner of Mitre Square while the killer did his work, then it had been soaked in the blood of the crime. And blood, as two modern scientists were about to prove, remembers everything. The providence was as strange as everything else in this case. The story attached to the shawl said it had been picked up that very night by a police officer who was at the scene, a sergeant named Amos Simpson. So the account goes, who, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, took the cloth home rather than logging it as evidence. Maybe he thought his wife would like the silk. Maybe he simply pocketed a curiosity, the way people did in an age before evidence chains and sealed bags. Whatever the reason, the shawl never entered any official record. It went home to policemen, and it stayed in his family, folded away, passed from hand to hand down the generations like an heirloom nobody quite wanted and nobody quite dared throw out. And that, for the skeptics, was exactly the problem. Because a piece of evidence that never appears in a single police report that vanishes from history the moment it supposedly leaves a crime scene is a piece of evidence with a hole in the middle of it. For over a century, serious historians looked at the shawl and shrugged. It was, in their view, Ripper one of the endless flood of fakes, forgeries, and wishful relics that had attached themselves to the case like barnacles. There was a whole cottage industry of it. Letters supposedly written by the killer, knives supposedly used by the killer, bricks from walls the killer had supposedly leaned against. In a mystery this hungry, anyone could claim anything, and plenty of people did. So the shawl sat in the reject pile of history, dismissed by the very experts who might have cared most about it. But not everyone was willing to let it go. And in the year 2007, the shawl came up for auction, and a man walked into that room who was about to stake everything he had on the belief that it was real. His name was Russell Edwards. He was not a detective. He was not a scientist. He was an author and a self-described amateur sleuth, one of the countless people the Ripper case had swallowed whole over the years. The difference being that Edwards had the money, the obsession, and the sheer nerve to do something about it. He looked at that tattered length of silk with its ugly brown stains and its impossible-sounding story. And where others saw junk, he saw the one thing the phantom might have left behind. He bought it. And then he did something that 120 years of investigators before him could never even have imagined. He decided to make it talk. The Victorian police could stand over that shawl and see only cloth and dried blood. They had no way to reach inside those stains. No way to pull a name out of a smear of brown on old silk. But Edwards was living in a different world. A world where a single cell, a fragment too small to see, could be unspooled and read like a signature. He knew the science existed. Music, what he needed was someone who could actually do it. Because this was not going to be an ordinary test. This was going to be one of the hardest jobs in forensic science. So he went looking for an expert, and he found one of the best in the world, a researcher named Dr. Jari Hallinen based at Liverpool John Moore University, a specialist whose entire career revolved around one impossibly delicate problem. How did it recover genetic material from samples that are old, degraded, ruined, and by every reasonable standard dead? This is a kind of scientist who can take something the rest of us would throw in the bin music and coax a whisper of information out of it. If anyone on Earth could make the shawl speak, it was a man who spent his days working with genetic ghosts. And make no mistake, the odds were terrible. Consider what this piece of silk had been through. It was over 125 years old. It had spent that century and a quarter not sealed in a vault under climate control, but folded in drawers, stuffed in boxes. Music, handled by curious relatives, unfolded and refolded, exposed to damp English air, to sunlight, to dust, to the oils of countless human hands. Every one of those touches, every one of those years was an enemy of the very thing Edwards was hunting. DNA is a fragile molecule. Time breaks it apart. Moisture breaks it apart. Sunlight breaks it apart. Handling smears it, contaminates it, buries it under the traces of everyone who ever touched music, the cloth. By any sane assessment, getting a clean, readable genetic profile off this object was not difficult. It was closer to a miracle. But there was one narrow door left open, and Luhalainen knew exactly where to look. He did not go after the fibers of the shawl themselves. He went after the stains, those old brown marks, the ones that had made everyone else dismiss the thing as garbage. Were, if the story was true, the residue of the crime itself. And residue can trap and shelter genetic material far longer than open cloth ever could. So the team music focused there, working with almost surgical patience, isolating tiny sections of the darkest stains, music, and beginning the painstaking process of extraction. And here is where the science gets clever. Music, where it stops being ordinary DNA testing and becomes something built specifically to reach back through more than a century of time. Because the kind of genetic material Hallinen was chasing was not the standard DNA most people picture, the double helix wound up inside the nucleus of a cell. That kind is powerful, but it's also relatively scarce and fragile. And in a sample this old and this abused, most music of it will be long gone. Instead, the team went after a different, tougher, more abundant kind of genetic material, something called mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA for short. To understand why that choice mattered, you have to understand what makes mitochondrial DNA so special and so perfectly suited to a case exactly like this one. Every cell in your body contains tiny structures called mitochondria, the little power plants that keep the cell running. And each of those carries its own small loop of DNA separate from the DNA in the nucleus. There are hundreds, sometimes thousands of these in a single cell, which means there's far more mitochondrial DNA to find than nuclear DNA. In a degraded sample, where most of the genetic material has been destroyed, that abundance is music, everything. It's the difference between searching for one specific grain of sand and searching for 1,000 copies of it. But the truly remarkable part, the part that turns mitochondrial DNA into a kind of time machine, is how it's inherited. Unlike the DNA in your nucleus, which is a shuffled mix of your mother and your father, mitochondrial DNA comes down to you from one source only, your mother and her mother before her and her mother before that, back and back and back in an unbroken female line stretching across thousands of years. A man carries his mother's mitochondrial DNA, but he does not pass it on. Only women hand it down, which means the mitochondrial signature living in your cells right now is in essence the same signature carried by a woman who lived centuries ago, a direct genetic echo of your maternal ancestors, remarkably unchanged across the generations. That stability is exactly why forensic scientists reach for it when everything else has failed. Nuclear DNA degrades quickly and shuffles wildly from parent to child. But mitochondrial DNA is music, stubborn. It endures. It survives fire and rotten time. And it stays recognizably the same down a maternal line for so long that a sample taken today can be laid beside a sample from the 1800s, and the two can genuinely be compared. In a case that was more than 120 years cold, that unbroken thread was not just useful, It was the only music bridge that could possibly reach the far shore. So the plan took shape, and it was a beautiful, almost audacious plan. If they could pull mitochondrial DNA off the shawl, they would need something to compare it against. A living person. Someone whose own maternal line ran back unbroken to one of the people who had been present that night on the 30th of September, 1888. And the first person they needed to find was not a suspect at all. It was a victim, because before you can prove who committed crime, you have to prove that the object in your hands was ever really at the scene of it. Everything depended on that. If the shawl was a fake, a bit of Victorian silk someone had, dressed up with old stains to fool collectors, then any DNA on it matched to anyone would mean absolutely nothing. The authenticity had to come first. And so the search began for a descendant of Catherine Eddowes, not just any relative. The line had to run through women only, mother, music, to daughter, right down to someone alive today. It's a peculiar kind of detective work, this genealogical hunting done not in dark alleys, but in dusty parish registers, music, in census records, in the faded ink of birth and marriage and death certificates. The team traced the branches of Catherine's family tree outward and downward, music, following the female line through the generations, past 2 world wars, past the collapse of the old East End slums into the modern age, and eventually, extraordinarily, they found her. A living woman going about an ordinary modern life, entirely unaware that the blood running through her carried a music genetic fingerprint, reaching all the way back to a murder victim from the age of gaslight and horse-drawn cabs. She was a descendant of Catherine's music sister, and that meant her maternal line, and Catherine shared the same ancient mitochondrial signature. They took a sample from her, a simple swab, painless, a fraction of a second discomfort for a link across more than a century, and then they compared it against the DNA in music. The laboratory had coaxed out the bloodstains soaked deep into the fibers of the shawl. Imagine the tension in that laboratory. Years of work, thousands of music, pounds spent, a reputation staked on a gamble everyone else had called foolish. All of it coming down to whether 2 music sequences of genetic code separated by 4 generations and 120-odd years would line up. And according to the team, they did, not approximately, not suggestively, a match. The mitochondrial DNA from the bloodstains on the shawl matched the mitochondrial DNA of the living descendant of Catherine Eddowes' sister. Let that settle for music a moment. Because of everything in this story, this was a finding that changed the whole picture. It meant the shawl was not a fake. It meant that scrap of tattered silk, dismissed for a century as sentimental junk, as Ripper Tat Hawk to the gullible, had been telling the truth all along. It had been there. It had lain in that dim square in Whitechapel in the small hours of the morning, and it had drunk up the blood of a woman who had only minutes before been alive and breathing and hoping to earn a few coins for a bed. The object was real. The provenance the policeman's family had guarded for generations was, at least in this respect, exactly what they had always claimed. The shawl had been at the scene, and it had touched the victim. For Russell Edwards, this alone would have been vindication enough. He had bet on a hunch, and the hunch had held. But of course, proving the shawl was authentic was only ever the doorway. The real prize lay beyond it, because if the shawl had genuinely been at the scene, soaked in Catherine Eddowes' blood, then it might carry more than her blood. It might carry something left behind by the man who spilled it, music. And this is where the story takes its darkest and most disputed turn. When the team examined the shawl more closely, they reported finding mixed in among the traces of the victim other biological material, not just blood. According to the analysis, there were stains consistent with something else entirely. Samples the researchers identified as consistent with semen, and that single detail reframed everything about what this cloth might be. It suggested that the person who attacked Catherine Eddowes had not simply killed her and vanished, but had music, in his moment of frenzy, in that grotesque eruption of rage and compulsion,